She was being placed in the back of a police cruiser, and my God, she hadn't stolen a thing. The blue and red lights painted the narrow street a frantic, pulsing tableau. Winter air bit deep, but it wasn't the cold that made my breath catch in my throat, nor the icy grip that clenched my chest. No, it was the raw, impossible sight of Elena Rossi, parishioner, widow, mother, saint, being guided almost tenderly into the stark confines of a squad car. Her head was bowed. Her shoulders, so often carrying the weight of the world with quiet grace, were now slumped in utter, shattering defeat. The uniform of Officer Miller, a good man from a good family, seemed to blot out the last vestiges of dignity she possessed. This wasn't right. It was a lie. An absurdity so profound it buckled the very foundations of my priestly understanding of justice, of faith, of the world God had placed us in. Father Michael O'Connell, a man who had seen too much grief and too little joy in this struggling corner of St. Jude's Parish, found himself staring into a void of the inexplicable. They were accusing her of theft. 2 baskets of groceries, the officers mumbled, their voices tight with their own discomfort, their faces etched with a bewilderment that mirrored my own. 2 baskets, enough to feed her starving children, enough to break a heart, but not enough to account for the chill that had just crawled down my spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the biting wind and everything to do with the unsettling, impossible truth I knew in my soul. Elena Rossi, a woman whose piety I would later stake my reputation on, whose unwavering faith had been a quiet beacon in our often despairing community, was incapable of such an act. This wasn't hyperbole, not the blind affection of a pastor for his flock. This was a stone-cold fact, as certain as the rising sun. Elena would sooner cut off her own hand than take a penny that wasn't hers, let alone something as substantial as food. Her pride, her honor, her unshakable moral compass, these were as much a part of her as the rosary beads she always carried. This was the first impossible contradiction, the first crack in the mundane reality of that awful night. My mind reeled. It refused to reconcile the gentle, devout woman I knew with the callous criminal the scene implied. But then came the second contradiction, an even more profound impossibility that ripped the fabric of logic itself. I questioned Officer Miller, my voice hoarse, barely audible over the crackle of his radio. What was stolen, officer? From where? He shifted, uneasy, avoiding my gaze. 2 baskets, father. Groceries? From the market, we think. We think. The words hung like stale breath in the frigid air. We think. This was not the language of evidence but of speculation, of a bad dream. I knew Mrs. Henderson, who ran the small general store, and the Fiores, who owned the bakery. They were good people, struggling like everyone else. I knew them well enough to know they would never press charges against Elena, even if she had taken something. More importantly, I knew their meticulous ledgers, their eagle eyes. And as the truth, colder than any January night, began to unfold from Officer Miller's reluctant admissions, my blood ran cold. There had been no report, no stolen goods, no victim, nothing. Absolutely nothing had been reported stolen that night. The words echoed in my skull, a grotesque, nonsensical mantra. A crime without a victim? A theft without stolen goods? An accusation born from thin air, yet weighty enough to put a woman in a police car, to shatter her world? It was an accusation. A phantom accusation, a whisper of suspicion from a vigilant neighbor. Martha Gable, I later learned, her curtains twitching like accusatory eyes across the narrow street, that had somehow materialized into the very tangible, crushing reality of a police investigation. But investigate what? A void? A shadow? I stood there, a shepherd watching his lamb being led away by phantoms. The flashing lights pulsed, a silent siren of distress, casting long, distorted shadows of trees and houses that seemed to writhe with their own bewilderment. Elena's small home, usually a beacon of quiet resilience, now stood dark and desolate behind the departing cruiser, an empty shell that cried out against the injustice. I could almost hear the bewildered silence of her children, Leo and Sophia, tucked away in their beds, innocent of the surreal drama unfolding just outside their window. Had they woken? Had they seen their mother, their rock, their last remaining comfort, vanish into the night? The thought clawed at my gut. My mind, trained in theological precision, in the logic of divine mysteries and human suffering, struggled to grapple with this sheer, unadulterated absurdity. It wasn't just a simple mistake. It was an ontological impossibility. How could a crime exist when its fundamental elements were absent? How could such an egregious accusation take root without a seed of truth, a grain of evidence? It defied every legal precedent, every moral principle, every law of cause and effect I understood. As I watched the flashing lights pull away from her small, desperate home, shrinking into the distant street lamp glow until they were just pinpricks of frantic color against the inky blackness, a profound, unsettling certainty settled over me. It was not the cold certainty of a legal injustice, nor the heartbreaking certainty of a community's failure. No, it was something far stranger, far more ancient, far more terrifying in its implications. I knew, with a certainty that reached into the marrow of my bones, that I was not witnessing the start of a criminal case. This was no ordinary human failing. This was no simple error in judgment, no mere misunderstanding. This was something else entirely. Something divine. Something that bent reality until it screamed. This was the baffling prelude to a miracle. And I knew in that gut-wrenching moment that my life, my understanding of faith, and the very fabric of our parish were about to be irrevocably, impossibly, breathtakingly altered. And for the full, impossible truth of that night, dear reader, we must journey back, much further back. And for the full, impossible truth of that night, dear reader, we must journey back, much further back. We must journey back through the seasons, through the subtle shifts in light and shadow that mark the passage of time in a small, struggling town like ours. To understand that night, the night the very air itself seemed to hum with the presence of the divine, you must first understand the arduous months that preceded it, the slow, relentless grinding down of a spirit, a will, a family, against the unyielding stone of circumstance. Our story, like so many profound human dramas, begins with an ending. The funeral of Marco Rossi. Ah, Marco, a man of quiet strength, a carpenter whose hands, though calloused from years of working the lumber in the old mill district, could carve the most delicate of birds from a block of pine. He was the kind of man who built things not just with wood, but with steady devotion. A sturdy home for his family, a reputation for honesty that shone brighter than any gold, and a quiet, unshakable love for his Elena and their two bright-eyed children, Leo and Sophia. He was a pillar, one of the silent, enduring cornerstones of our parish, St. Jude's. His passing then was not merely a private grief, but a tremor that ran through the very foundations of our community. A sudden sickness, merciless and swift, had swept through the old mill district that winter, a particularly harsh and unyielding season that had already claimed several of our elderly parishioners. It was a brutal cough at first, then a fever that burned like an internal fire, consuming him rapidly. I remember administering the last rites in their small, tidy living room, the air heavy with the scent of lilies Elena had somehow found, and the faint, sweet smell of wood shavings that always clung to Marco, even in his final days. His eyes, though clouded with pain and the encroaching shadow of death, held a peace, a surrender that spoke volumes of his profound faith. He looked at Elena, his gaze a silent benediction, then at Leo and Sophia, their small faces pale and tear-streaked, and a single tear traced a path through the sweat on his temple. Then he was gone, a final ragged breath escaping into the chill air. The immediate aftermath, as it often is in such tragedies, was a testament to the deep, abiding spirit of St. Jude's. Our parish, I must confess, is not a wealthy one in terms of material possessions. Our stained glass windows are lovely but simple, our steeple weathered by years of wind and rain, and our rectory, well, let's just say it has character that far outstrips its modern amenities. But we are rich, unimaginably rich, in community. We are a tapestry woven from threads of shared joy and sorrow, of hardship borne and triumph celebrated together. And in the face of Marco's death, that tapestry drew tighter around Elena and her children. The casseroles arrived first, steaming dishes of chicken and rice, hearty stews, and comforting baked goods, carried by neighbors with solemn faces and whispered words of sympathy. Then came the envelopes, slipped quietly into Elena's hand, often anonymously, a silent testament to the generosity that blooms in the face of shared grief. Small bundles of cash, tucked away with blessings, meant to ease the immediate burden, to buy time for a widow navigating the bewildering landscape of sudden loss. Our Ladies' Guild organized a meal train that lasted for weeks, ensuring a warm supper graced her table each evening. Parishioners offered to watch Leo and Sophia, to run errands, to simply sit in quiet solidarity. I myself visited often, not just as a priest to offer spiritual comfort, but as a friend, to listen, to bear witness to her grief, and to assure her, repeatedly, that the church, her family, would not abandon her. And for a time, we did not. The warmth of that initial embrace was palpable, a comforting cloak against the biting wind of sorrow. Elena, ever gracious, accepted the help with a quiet dignity that touched us all. Her gratitude was not effusive but visible in the slight easing of her shoulders, the faint, fleeting smiles she offered. She was a woman who always repaid kindness threefold, even in her darkest hour, always baking a small loaf of bread for those who brought her food, or offering a mended garment to a neighbor whose clothes had frayed. But, as it always does, the initial fervor of support began, slowly, imperceptibly, to dwindle. It is not a failing of the human heart, I have learned through decades in the ministry, but a simple, sad truth of life's relentless forward momentum. New crises arise, other needs demand attention, and the acute pain of one family's loss gradually recedes into the chronic ache of memory. The casseroles grew less frequent, the envelopes stopped arriving, and the offers of childcare became rarer. Life, with its thousand demands, pulls us inexorably back into its current. The well-meaning whispers of, "Let us know if you need anything, Elena," began to feel less like genuine invitations and more like distant echoes, fading into the background hum of daily existence. I watched this slow attrition with a heavy heart, my own pastoral duties often pulling me in a dozen directions. Elena, a woman of profound faith, possessed an equally profound pride. It was not the haughty pride of arrogance, no, but a fierce, almost sacred sense of self-reliance, a deeply ingrained belief in earning one's way, in carrying one's own burdens before ever considering imposing them upon another. To ask for help for her was not merely an admission of need, but an act of surrender to helplessness, a concession that her own efforts, her own prayers, were insufficient. It was a testament to her dignity, yes, but also a silent, agonizing barrier. She never once came to the rectory to ask for aid. Never. Not even a hint, not a timid knock on the door, nor a hushed word after Mass. I admired her strength, even as it pained me to witness the silent struggle it imposed upon her. Week after week I would see her at Sunday Mass, always in the same modest, carefully mended dress, her children scrubbed clean and quiet beside her. The way the morning light filtered through the simple stained glass of St. Jude's would fall upon her face seemed, to my eyes, to illuminate the growing shadows beneath her gentle hazel eyes. Each week those shadows deepened, etching faint lines of exhaustion around their corners. Her hands, though clasped devoutly in prayer, seemed to tremble ever so slightly. Her posture, once gracefully erect, now bore the subtle curve of one carrying an invisible, unbearable weight. I would watch her during the homily, her gaze fixed on the altar, listening with an intensity that suggested she was clinging to every word, every promise of divine solace, as if it were a lifeline. I saw the way her lips moved in silent prayer during the consecration, not the usual reverent murmurings, but what appeared to be urgent, almost desperate supplications. My heart would ache as I watched her, a woman of such quiet fortitude, clearly wrestling with a cross far too heavy for her slender frame. A cross not merely of grief, for grief, though devastating, can be shared and lightened, but a cross of impending despair, of material want pressing down upon the spiritual wellsprings of her faith. I often thought of approaching her directly, of offering a discreet envelope from the parish poor box, or arranging for a grocery delivery under some invented pretext. But her pride, that magnificent, stubborn, heartbreaking virtue, held me back. I knew that to offer her charity directly, unbidden, would wound her deeply. It would feel like an accusation of failure, a public acknowledgement of her inability to cope, precisely what she fought so valiantly to conceal. It was a delicate dance, this pastoral care, balancing the imperative to help with the sacred duty to respect a soul's dignity. So I watched, I prayed, and I hoped that her own deep faith, so evident in her every gesture, would somehow miraculously find a way to sustain her. But as the weeks bled into months, and the autumn winds began to carry the first chill whispers of winter, even my own seasoned optimism began to wane, giving way to a gnawing apprehension. I knew, with a sinking feeling, that her prayers, once whispers of thanksgiving, must surely be transforming into cries for deliverance, and I feared, profoundly, for what might happen when even those cries seemed to go unanswered. And I feared, profoundly, for what might happen when even those cries seemed to go unanswered. The chill of those autumn winds, which had whispered mere possibility at first, soon sharpened into the biting breath of winter, carrying with it not just the promise of snow but the undeniable truth of scarcity. The initial outpouring of community support, as generous and heartfelt as it had been in the wake of Marco's sudden passing, inevitably began to ebb. Life, in its relentless current, pulls us all forward, and the well-meaning hands that had once offered succor found themselves busy once more with their own daily tides. Casseroles stopped appearing, envelopes grew lighter, then vanished. It was not a failure of love, mind you, but merely the natural tapering of immediate crisis support, leaving Elena Rossi to face the long, unforgiving stretch of widowhood alone, her two young children, Leo and Sophia, looking to her with eyes that still held the bewildered grief of their father's absence, now slowly dimming into the shadow of another, more primal, hunger. Elena, bless her valiant heart, was not one to simply sit and wait for fortune to turn. Her hands, though slender, were accustomed to work, and she sought it with a tireless resolve that would put many a younger, less burdened soul to shame. She took on what odd job she could find in our struggling mill town. There were dresses to mend, seams to stitch, buttons to replace for the few who could still afford such luxuries, their fabrics often worn thin from years of wear. Like the town's own dwindling prosperity, She cleaned houses, scrubbing floors and dusting forgotten corners for neighbors whose own means were often just a step or two above her own. Their payments meager, sometimes in kind, a bag of apples, a jar of homemade preserves, but always gratefully received. I would sometimes see her, a small solitary figure walking briskly through the twilight, her shoulders hunched against the cold, a small satchel clutched tightly in her hand, the faint scent of lemon polish or old lace clinging to her clothes like a faint melancholic perfume. Each time, my heart would ache with a mixture of admiration and profound concern. The work was scarce, however, a fragile lifeline in an ocean of need. St. Jude's was not an affluent parish, and the jobs available reflected that harsh reality. Every penny earned was meticulously accounted for, every expenditure weighed with a solemnity usually reserved for matters of theological import. I knew, without her ever speaking a word of it, that the small savings Marco had left, a modest provision born of a lifetime of honest labor, was diminishing. I pictured it as a stone dropping down a deep, dark well, the initial splash quickly giving way to an ominous silence, the descent growing longer, slower, until at last, after what seemed an eternity, the final, inevitable splash echoed with the chilling finality of an empty basin. She would often arrive for Mass on Sundays, her children neat and scrubbed, their small faces bright, but I saw the telltale signs in Elena herself. The way her winter coat, though clean, seemed to have grown thinner, the subtle tremor in her hands as she received communion, the deepening hollows beneath her eyes that no amount of prayer or sleep seemed able to fill. She carried herself with the same quiet dignity, her gaze direct, her smile gentle, but there was a fragility now, a translucent quality to her being, as if the very light of her inner spirit was struggling to hold against the encroaching shadows. My own apprehension deepened with each passing week. I wrestled with how to approach her, how to offer aid without wounding that fierce, beautiful pride that was as much a part of her as her faith. To simply give her money, even from the poor box, would, I knew, feel like a public declaration of her failure, an unbearable humiliation for a woman who valued self-sufficiency almost as highly as sanctity. I considered sending a parish volunteer with a food basket, but then dismissed the thought. It would still carry the sting of charity, and Elena, I suspected, would politely refuse, her eyes veiled by a quiet shame. It was a dilemma that weighed heavily on my soul, a reminder of the often cruel limitations of human assistance when faced with a spirit as fiercely independent as hers. Finally, after weeks of agonizing internal debate, I concocted a plan. It was not elegant, perhaps, but it felt right, infused with a certain pastoral cunning born of genuine care. I would visit her under the guise of a routine parish wellness check, a pleasant euphemism for a visit intended to assess the well-being of a family, particularly one I knew to be struggling. I told myself it was part of my duty, a proactive measure, and hoped that the official nature of the visit would allow her to accept it without feeling the sting of personal charity. It was late afternoon when I set out, the sky a muted pewter gray, promising snow that never quite arrived. The air was frigid, biting at my ears, and the few children still playing outside wore coats too thin for the season, their breath pluming like small, desperate prayers. The streets were quiet, the usual afternoon bustle hushed by the cold, and the sound of my own footsteps seemed amplified, a solemn rhythm accompanying my thoughts. Elena's house, small and unassuming, stood near the end of a row of similar working-class homes, their clapboard siding faded, their porches bearing the marks of countless seasons. A wreath, homemade from pine cones and dried berries, still clung to her door from Christmas, a touch of lingering festivity that felt bravely defiant against the starkness of the landscape. I knocked gently, my heart a little heavy with trepidation, and waited. After a moment I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps, and the door opened a crack. Elena stood there, her face etched with fatigue but softened by a polite, if weary, smile. "Father Michael," she said, her voice a little hushed, as if to preserve the fragile peace within. "What a surprise! Please, come in." She opened the door wider, stepping back to allow me entry, and I felt the rush of cold air from outside meet the subtle, almost imperceptible chill of her home. The house, even now, was scrupulously clean. Every surface gleamed, every rug was swept, every piece of worn furniture arranged with care. It was a testament to her enduring spirit, her refusal to let despair conquer her sense of order and dignity. The children, I noted, were nowhere to be seen, likely at school or perhaps playing in a neighbor's yard, offering a small mercy of quiet to their mother. But despite the cleanliness, an undeniable starkness pervaded the small rooms. The windows, though spotless, let in a pale, muted light that seemed to hold little warmth. There were no small, frivolous adornments, no overflowing baskets of toys, no extra blankets thrown casually over the sofa. Everything was essential, pared down to the absolute minimum, a living testament to quiet austerity. "Thank you, Elena," I said, Stepping inside, feeling the slight chill immediately penetrate my coat, I repressed a shiver. I hope I'm not disturbing you. I was just making my rounds, checking in on our parishioners, particularly with the colder weather settling in. I tried to sound casual, matter of fact, to ease any potential discomfort. Not at all, Father, she replied, gesturing towards a simple wooden armchair. Please make yourself comfortable. It's a joy to have you. She paused, her gaze momentarily dropping, then lifted it again, her expression determined. Can I offer you something? A cup of tea? I smiled gently, knowing the offer was likely made out of habit and good manners rather than abundance. Just a glass of water, please, if it's no trouble, I said, hoping to simplify things for her. Of course, she murmured, and turned towards the small kitchen alcove. As she moved, her back momentarily obscured the doorway to what I knew to be her small pantry. It was a fleeting moment, a mere second, but as she reached for a glass from a shelf, the angle shifted, and my gaze, unbidden, darted into the open pantry door. My breath caught in my throat. My heart, which had been beating with a gentle, concerned rhythm, now gave a sudden, painful lurch. The summary description, little more than a bag of flour and a few cans of beans, was, if anything, generous. The shelves, once undoubtedly stocked, were now almost entirely bare. There, on the lowest shelf, sat a half-empty bag of flour, its paper-thin sides sagging from use, a testament to countless simple loaves or meager gravies. Beside it, 2, perhaps 3, dented cans of what appeared to be kidney beans, or maybe chickpeas, their labels faded. Above them, a single lonely onion rested on a wooden slat, its papery skin dry and brittle. And that was all. No sugar, no coffee, no fresh vegetables, no jars of preserves, no hidden treats for the children. The emptiness echoed, vast and profound, a chasm in the very heart of a home. It was not just a lack of food, it was a lack of hope, a physical manifestation of a family hanging by the thinnest of threads. I quickly averted my eyes, trying to maintain a placid expression, a casual demeanor, as if I had seen nothing but the normal, everyday contents of a well-ordered pantry. But the image was seared into my mind, a stark, painful tableau that spoke more eloquently than any words. The chill in the house now felt less like the winter air, and more like the icy grip of despair. The low heat, which I had noted upon entering, was not just about saving on bills. It was about the impossible choice between a few degrees of warmth and a few more mouthfuls of sustenance. Elena returned with a glass of water, cool and clear, offering it with both hands. "Thank you, my dear," I said, taking it, my voice, I hoped, steady. I took a slow sip, allowing myself a moment to compose my thoughts, to push back the surge of helplessness that threatened to overwhelm me. We spoke then, of the parish, of the children's schooling, of the lingering aches of winter. She answered my questions politely, her answers brief, almost clipped. She maintained her brave face, speaking of God's providence with a quiet steadfastness that was both admirable and, in that moment, heartbreaking. "God is good, Father," she said, her gaze fixed on the small chipped statue of the Blessed Mother on her mantelpiece, the only visible decoration in the living room. "He always provides. We manage." I listened, my heart heavy. I heard the tremor beneath her words, the subtle strain in her voice, the way her eyes, though unwavering in their faith, held a deeper, more desperate plea. It was a beautiful declaration, yes, a testament to her profound piety, but it was also a shield, a bulwark against the raw truth that threatened to consume her. She was speaking the truth as she understood it, as she believed it, but the reality of the bare pantry, the frigid air, the very silence of the house, spoke of a providence that felt agonizingly slow in its arrival. I tried subtly to open a door. "Elena," I began, choosing my words with care. "St. Jude's, as you know, has a small fund for families facing unforeseen difficulties. Sometimes a little help can make a world of difference, just to get over a rough patch." I saw her stiffen almost imperceptibly, a flicker of something in her eyes that was not anger, but a deep, unyielding resolve. "That's very kind of you, Father," she said, her voice soft but firm, her gaze still on the Blessed Mother. "But we are fine. Truly. Others, I am sure, are in far greater need. God has seen us through much worse, and He will continue to do so. We must simply keep faith." She smiled then, a tight, almost painful smile that did not quite reach her weary eyes. It was a polite refusal, absolute and unyielding. I knew then that I could push no further without causing her the very pain I sought to avoid. Her pride, a double-edged sword, was both her strength and, in this moment, her formidable barrier. I could only offer my prayers, and my silent, heartfelt admiration for a woman who would rather starve than accept what she perceived as charity. As I took my leave, walking back into the biting cold of the late afternoon, the image of that empty pantry haunted me. I thought of her words, "He always provides." Yes, I knew that to be true, in the deepest spiritual sense. But how did that provision manifest when the physical cupboard was bare, when 2 small children depended on it? Her faith, once a sturdy oak, was now, I realized, being stretched to its absolute breaking point, a taut wire vibrating with an unbearable tension. Her prayers, she would later confess to me in the quiet intimacy of the confessional, had indeed transformed. They were no longer the gentle, grateful whispers of thanks, the patient petitions for guidance, but raw, visceral cries for deliverance. They were the desperate pleas of a mother, alone in the deepening twilight, facing the cold, hard reality that even a loving God, in his inscrutable wisdom, sometimes demands an unimaginable test. And I, her humble shepherd, could only watch, pray, and fear, profoundly, for the night when those cries might rise to the heavens, loud and clear, yet still seem to echo unanswered in the quiet desperation of her home. The night I speak of, that singular, etched-in-memory evening that would come to define Elena's unshakable faith and challenge our own, did not begin with the sudden drama that marked its close. No, it unfolded slowly, inexorably, with the quiet, chilling dread of a winter dawn, each moment a subtle tightening of a noose around a mother's heart. The day, I remember Elena telling me, arrived with a deceptive softness, a pale sliver of light pushing through the thin curtains of her children's room, a light that seemed to mock the growing darkness within her own soul. She had awoken before them, as always, the silence of the house pressing down on her with a weight heavier than any physical burden. The air was cold, a chill that had nothing to do with the external temperature, and everything to do with the gnawing emptiness she felt. She had spent a fitful night, tossing and turning on a mattress that had long lost its resilience, her mind a relentless mill grinding worries into dust. The image of the few remaining oats in the small chipped ceramic bowl on the counter had been her last thought before sleep finally claimed her, and her first upon waking. It was the last crumb of hope in a larder that had, overnight, become a tomb. She rose, her body stiff and protesting, not from physical exertion but from the sheer exhaustion of emotional strain. Her feet, bare against the cold linoleum, carried her with a leaden reluctance towards the kitchen. Each step was a silent prayer, a plea for strength to face a day she knew held no answers, only questions she was ill-equipped to confront. The morning light, sparse and gray, fell upon the counter, illuminating with cruel clarity the small glassine bag of oatmeal. Perhaps a cup left, she thought, her fingers tracing the rough texture of the counter. Enough, barely, for Leo and Sophia. The decision was not even a conscious one. It was an instinct as old as motherhood itself, a primal command etched into her very being. They must eat. Her own hunger was a dull ache, a constant companion she had learned to live with, to ignore, to offer up. But the thought of her children's small, vulnerable stomachs twisting with the same emptiness was a torment she could not, would not, endure. She busied herself with the familiar ritual of breakfast, a macabre ballet performed with an empty heart. The small pot, warmed on the only functioning burner of her old stove, hissed faintly as the water, rationed carefully from the tap, came to a boil. She measured out the oatmeal with a trembling hand, her gaze fixed on the dwindling supply, each flake a precious commodity. She stirred slowly, meticulously, willing the few grains to expand, to somehow multiply, to stretch into something more substantial than they truly were. A dollop of the last evaporated milk, a precious spoonful of sugar, luxuries she could not afford herself, but necessities for tiny palates that still sought comfort and sweetness in a world growing increasingly bitter. When the children finally stirred, their small, sleepy voices a fragile melody in the quiet house, Elena plastered on a smile, a mask of cheer she had perfected over these long, lean months. "Breakfast time, my little ones," she chirped, her voice a little too bright, a little too forced. Leo, 7 years old and already exhibiting his father's quiet strength, rubbed his eyes, his hair a tousled mop. Sophia, just 5, clambered down from her bed, a small, vibrant splash of color in a world turning muted. They ate their oatmeal, oblivious to the momentous significance of that meager meal. Leo devoured his with the earnest hunger of a growing boy, while Sophia, ever the pickier eater, pushed hers around the bowl with a spoon, occasionally taking a bite. Elena watched them, her heart a fragile vessel threatening to shatter with each spoonful. Each bite they took was a pang of both relief and dread. Relief that for this moment, their hunger was sated. Dread that there was nothing, absolutely nothing left to follow. "More, Mama?" Leo asked, holding out his empty bowl, a thin film of oatmeal clinging to the edges. Elena's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. "Not today, sweetheart," she said, her voice softer now, tinged with a carefully suppressed tremor. "Mama needs to save some for tomorrow, just in case." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth, but it was a kindness, she reasoned, a shield against a truth too cruel for their young ears. She collected the bowls, rinsing them meticulously, the sound of the running water a painful reminder of the dwindling funds and the impending shutoff. The day stretched out before them, an expanse of empty hours to be filled, distracted, endured. Elena tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, a charade of carefree domesticity. She read stories in voices she hoped sounded light and unburdened, though her throat often caught, thick with unshed tears. She encouraged them to play, to draw, to create worlds of their own, anything to divert their attention from the hollow ache that would surely begin to assert itself as the day wore on. But the house itself seemed to conspire against her efforts. The chill lingered, a persistent adversary. The faint scent of stale air, of poverty, clung to the furniture, whispering of abandonment. She remembered Marco, his booming laughter that had once filled these rooms, chasing away all shadows. She remembered the warmth of their life together, the simple meals shared, the easy abundance that now seemed like a distant, impossible dream. A fresh wave of grief, sharp and sudden, pierced through her carefully constructed defenses. She missed him not just as a husband, a lover, a companion, but as a provider, a protector, a bulwark against the harsh realities that now threatened to engulf them all. The stack of bills on the small kitchen table seemed to grow taller with each passing day, a relentless, silent monument to her despair. The gas bill, now several weeks past due, was a threat of impending cold. The electricity bill, adorned with a bold, red final notice, promised darkness. She had hidden them from the children, tucked them beneath a stack of old newspapers, but their presence was palpable, a chilling weight on her spirit. How could she possibly keep the house warm when the gas might be cut? How could she cook or simply light their way through the deepening evenings without power? The thought of her children shivering in the dark, their stomachs rumbling, their small faces etched with fear and confusion, was a horror that tightened her chest until she could barely breathe. As the afternoon waned, bringing with it the relentless slide towards evening, the subtle shifts in the children's demeanor began. Sophia grew fretful, whining about an indiscernible ache, her usual playful energy replaced by a listlessness that worried Elena more than any outward complaint. Leo, usually so resilient, grew quieter, his eyes, so like Marco's, seeming to hold a wisdom beyond his years, a flicker of understanding that tightened Elena's throat. He didn't ask for food, but she saw the way his gaze lingered on the empty cupboards when she walked past, the subtle tension in his small frame. "Mama, I'm thirsty," Sophia murmured, her voice reedy. Elena brought her a glass of water, cool and clear, but knew it was not what her daughter truly craved. Water could not fill the void, could not comfort the gnawing emptiness. She sat Sophia on her lap, stroking her hair, humming a lullaby, trying to conjure a warmth and a peace she did not feel herself. The clock on the mantelpiece, a wedding gift from Marco's mother, ticked with a measured, indifferent rhythm, each second dragging them closer to the inevitable moment of reckoning. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky with hues of bruised purple and fiery orange, a beauty Elena could not appreciate. The golden hour, usually a time of serene reflection, now seemed to mock her, highlighting the growing shadows within her home and her heart. The thought of preparing dinner, of going through the motions when there was nothing to prepare, was a grotesque pantomime she could not bear to enact. She tried to distract the children with games, with drawing, with whispered stories of far-off lands where every table groaned with food, where no child ever knew the pangs of hunger. But even their young minds, so resilient and imaginative, seemed to sense the underlying tension, the pervasive dread that seeped into every corner of their home. Finally, as the last vestiges of daylight bled from the sky, Elena knew she could postpone it no longer. "Time for bed, my darlings," she announced, her voice a little rough now, worn thin by the day's relentless battle. The protests were mild, subdued, perhaps muted by the quiet ache in their bellies. She led them to their small beds, the thin blankets a poor defense against the chill that had truly settled in now. The gas heat, she knew, would likely be cut any day, perhaps even tomorrow. She knelt beside Sophia's bed first, pulling the blanket up to her chin, her fingers tracing the delicate curve of her cheek. Sophia whimpered softly, a tiny, pained sound that tore at Elena's already frayed composure. "Tell me a story, Mama," she whispered, her eyes wide and dark in the encroaching gloom. Elena took a deep, shuddering breath and began to spin a tale, a familiar one about a brave little mouse and a magical garden. But her mind was elsewhere, her focus constantly pulled back to the hollowness she knew Sophia felt. She felt the tremor in the child's small body, a faint shiver, and she knew it was not just the cold. It was the hunger, finally asserting its claim, demanding recognition. She moved to Leo's bed. He was older, more aware, and when she sat on the edge of his mattress, he turned to her, his young eyes searching hers with a depth that startled her. "I'm hungry, Mama," he said, not as a complaint, but as a statement of fact, delivered with a quiet resignation that twisted her gut into a knot. The truth, raw and brutal, was finally spoken aloud. Elena gathered him into her arms, holding him close, pressing his small head against her shoulder. She could feel the fragile prominence of his ribs beneath his thin nightshirt. Her own body, weakened by weeks of deprivation, yearned to absorb his pain, to somehow transmute his hunger into her own, to shield him completely. "I know, my sweet boy," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Mama knows." She rocked him gently, her gaze sweeping over the small darkened room, searching for any flicker of hope, any distant star in her suffocating night. There was none, only the chilling certainty of absolute lack. She offered them sips of water again, the cool liquid a small, inadequate comfort. "It helps," she murmured. "It helps your tummy feel better." They drank, obediently, trustingly, and Elena's heart splintered a little more with each swallow. How could she, a mother, have allowed her children to reach such a pass? The question echoed in the cavern of her despair, a relentless self-recrimination. She had worked, she had prayed, she had stretched every penny, swallowed her pride until it had become a bitter taste in her mouth. But it had not been enough. She had failed them. The thought, searing hot, branded itself onto her soul. When they finally drifted off to sleep, their breathing shallow and uneven, Elena sat beside their beds for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of their slumber, each soft sigh a torment. The house was utterly silent now, save for the rhythmic ticking of the clock, a relentless march towards an unknown future. The gas bill, the electricity bill, the empty cupboards, the children's hunger, it all coalesced into a single overwhelming wave of desolation that threatened to drown her. She moved from their room, her steps slow and deliberate, as if each movement required a monumental effort. She walked into the small living room, the darkness there almost absolute, save for the faint, silvery glow of the street lamp filtering through the dusty window panes. Her eyes, accustomed to the gloom, found the small mantelpiece above the cold, unused fireplace. There, amidst a few faded photographs of Marco and the children, stood the small chipped statue of the Blessed Mother. It was old, perhaps an inheritance from her own grandmother, its paint peeling in places, its delicate features softened by time and countless touches. Mary, her head bowed in gentle compassion, held a tiny, chipped child in her arms. Elena stood before it, her body trembling not from cold, but from the unbearable weight of her anguish. Every human avenue had been exhausted. Every possibility had been explored and found wanting. There was no more pride to swallow, no more ingenious ways to stretch nothing into something. She was at the very precipice of despair, gazing into an abyss where her children's futures, their very lives, seemed to hang by a thread. And in that moment, when the last flicker of human hope seemed to gutter and die, something shifted within her. It was not a surge of renewed strength, nor a sudden burst of courage. It was a stripping away, a complete and utter surrender. All that remained was raw, unadulterated need. Her knees, weakened by hunger and grief, buckled. She sank to the floor, not in prayer initially, but in collapse, a heap of human fragility. The cold floor seeped into her bones, but she barely noticed. Her hands, gnarled and calloused from years of labor, reached out, finding purchase on the worn carpet before the mantelpiece. Her head bowed, resting against her folded arms, and the first sob, long and ragged, tore its way from her chest. It was not a gentle weeping, not the silent tears of quiet grief I had seen her shed so often. No, these were primal sounds, the guttural cries of a creature pushed beyond endurance, a mother witnessing the suffering of her young and finding herself utterly powerless. Her body shook with the force of her sorrow, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence of the house magnified her agony, reflecting it back to her, vast and unyielding. And then, through the tempest of her grief, her gaze lifted. Her eyes, swollen and blurred with tears, found the small chipped statue. Mary, Mother of Sorrows, Mother of God. The image, even in its humble state, spoke of a compassion that transcended human understanding, a love that had known the deepest suffering, a heart that had been pierced. Mother, the word was a broken whisper, torn from the very depths of her soul. Blessed Mother. She clasped her hands, not in a polite, formal gesture of prayer, but clutched them together as if to hold herself from unraveling completely. Her voice, hoarse and cracked, rose from the floor, not a petition but a desperate, bargaining plea. "Oh, Mother Mary, look upon my children. Look upon Leo, so brave, so good, so hungry. Look upon Sophia, so small, so fragile, so cold. I have nothing left, Mother, nothing. I have stretched every thread, emptied every corner, swallowed every ounce of pride. There is nothing in my house, nothing in my purse, nothing in my heart. But this pain. Her head shook slowly, a gesture of absolute defeat. I beg you, mother, intercede for them. Not for me. I can bear this. I can bear any hunger, any cold, any darkness. I can bear the shame, the fear, the loneliness. I can bear it all, blessed mother. You know what it is to watch your child suffer. You know the sword that pierced your heart. Let it pierce mine again, if only to spare them. Tears streamed down her face, falling onto her clasped hands. Salty drops mingled with the dust of despair. Take me, mother. Take my life. Take my suffering. Let me bear their hunger. Let me bear their cold. Let me bear their fear. But please, I beg you, by the love you bore for your own son, by the pain you endured, by your unending mercy, let them eat. Let them be warm. Let them know, just for one night, that they are not abandoned. Let them know that they are loved, that they are seen, that they are not forgotten by God. She pressed her forehead against her clasped hands, her whole body convulsing with the intensity of her supplication. This was not the eloquent, beautifully phrased prayer of a parishioner in a pew. This was the raw, guttural cry of a mother's soul, stripped bare of everything but love and desperation. It was a challenge, a plea, an offering. Everything she was, everything she had, laid at the feet of the Virgin. I give you my life, mother, she choked out, her voice barely audible, a ragged whisper. I offer it all. Only feed my children. Only feed them. The silence that followed was profound, heavy with unspoken questions, with the vastness of heaven's indifference or its silent, watchful grace. Elena remained there, collapsed on the floor, her body utterly spent, her mind emptied of all thought save that one desperate maternal prayer. She had given everything, asked for nothing for herself, offered her very being as a sacrifice. And in that moment of absolute, complete desolation, the air in the small, cold house seemed to hum with an unbearable tension, a profound quietude that spoke either of the vast emptiness of the universe or of a moment pregnant with possibility, poised on the very edge of the miraculous. Her cries, once echoing unanswered, now hung in the ether, a bridge built of pure, unadulterated love, flung across the chasm of her despair, reaching for the very heart of God. Across the narrow street lived Martha Gable, a woman whose piety, while undeniably sincere in its outward expressions, was often overshadowed by her persistent penchant for gossip. It was, I often reflected, like a carefully pruned rosebush, whose exquisite blooms were secretly, relentlessly choked by an unseen tangle of briars at its very roots, a subtle corruption not of ill will but of human frailty. Her home, a testament to her meticulous nature, presented itself in stark contrast to Elena's, not in size or grandeur, for both were humble cottages of the Mill district, but in its unwavering, almost clinical order. While Elena's small house, even in its deepening despair, still held the soft, lived-in scent of children, of old wooden toys, and a lingering, fragile wisp of hope, Martha's exuded the crisp, almost sterile aroma of lemon polish, floor wax, and a pervasive, quiet, watchful solitude. There was a sense of things being perpetually put away, accounted for, scrubbed clean. Martha was, by all outward appearances, a bedrock of our saint. Jude's community, a diligent attendee at daily mass whose fervent responses could be heard throughout the nave, a tireless volunteer for the altar guild whose starched linens were always impeccably folded, and the keeper of an immaculate garden whose petunias and marigolds seemed to stand in military formation, each bloom a testament to strict discipline. She was, to anyone looking from the outside, a woman of God, diligent in her devotions, stern in her judgments, and unwavering in her belief in what was proper and righteous, with a morality as neatly clipped as her prize-winning hedges. Yet, for all her outward piety, Martha possessed a gaze that rarely missed a detail, especially when that detail pertained to the lives of others. It wasn't malice, not in the vulgar, destructive sense, that fueled her observations. Rather, it was a peculiar, often contradictory blend of genuine, if often misguided, concern for her neighbors, a deeply ingrained need for order in a world she perceived as increasingly chaotic, and perhaps a quiet, almost unconscious desire to reassure herself that her own life, with its predictable rhythms, its careful budgets, and its unwavering adherence to tradition, remained safely within the visible bounds of God's favor. I had come to understand, through long years of ministry, that for some, the perceived shortcomings of others served as a kind of bulwark against their own anxieties, a whispered prayer of thanks that, I am not like that. I knew Martha well. I had sat in her parlor for tea, a delicate porcelain cup warming my hands as I admired her needlepoint, always scriptural verses rendered in meticulous cross-stitch, and listened to her grievances. They were never angry outbursts, but always delivered with a sigh, a sorrowful shake of the head, and a lament about the way things are nowadays, implying a world in slow, regrettable descent from a golden, more orderly age. Her intentions, I truly believe, began from a place of Christian charity. When Marco passed, Martha was among the first to bring a steaming chicken pot pie, its golden crust still bubbling from the oven, and a word of sober comfort, her hand gently, almost tentatively, resting on Elena's shoulder. She had clucked over Elena's pallor, tutted at the sight of little Leo's tear-stained face, and promised to keep a watchful eye, a vow that, at the time, seemed a comfort. It was this very watchful eye, however, that proved to be both a blessing and ultimately a heavy burden for Martha herself and eventually for Elena. As the weeks turned into months and the initial wave of community sympathy, like all earthly tides, receded, Martha's pity began to curdle ever so slightly into suspicion. She had seen the initial bounty of casseroles and envelopes diminish, a natural enough progression as other needs arose and memories faded. But she had also seen Elena refuse, with a quiet dignity that Martha herself, ever practical and unbending, mistook for stubbornness, offers of help from the ladies' auxiliary. Pride. Martha would confide to Mrs. Henderson over coffee and freshly baked scones after Mass, her voice a low, mournful murmur. "Is a terrible thing, Mrs. Henderson, especially when it stands between a mother and her children's welfare." It was a pronouncement delivered with a sorrowful shake of the head, as if lamenting a moral failing, but one that carried the unmistakable, if subtle, weight of judgment, a seed planted in the fertile ground of local gossip. From her front window, a veritable command center disguised as a lace-curtained vantage point, Martha began to chronicle Elena's quiet decline. Her gaze, sharpened by a mixture of concern and a growing sense of unease, missed nothing. She noted the slow retreat of life from the little house across the street. The lights in Elena's living room, once burning late as Elena worked on mending for the few pennies it brought, or painstakingly tried to stretch Marco's meager savings, now extinguished themselves early, often plunging the small cottage into darkness long before Martha even considered retiring for the night. She catalogued the children's diminished laughter, which had once spilled like bright coins into the street, replaced instead by the low, haunting hum of their mournful cries, carried on the evening breeze, faint, yes, but unmistakable to Martha's keenly attentive ears. And perhaps most damningly, in Martha's meticulous mental ledger, she noted the conspicuous absence of grocery bags. No trips from the local market, no deliveries from the few generous souls who still tried to help, no packages left on the doorstep. The steady flow of provisions, a basic requirement for any household, had simply ceased. Each observation, each detail carefully filed away in the archives of her mind, chipped away at Martha's initial compassion, replacing it with a growing conviction that Elena was, in some inexplicable way, failing. Not just failing to provide, but failing to ask, failing to accept the very help that, in Martha's ordered view, was readily available. In Martha's world, a world built on clear rules and predictable outcomes, Elena's quiet suffering was an anomaly, an affront to reason, and therefore a source of profound unease. Martha, who prided herself on her good sense and her ability to discern right from wrong, found herself grappling with a situation that defied her logical frameworks. Why would a mother, a good Catholic woman, let her children go hungry when help, in Martha's mind, was merely a humble request away? It was a question that festered, nurturing the insidious seeds of suspicion, turning her concern into a rigid condemnation. On that particular evening, the very night Elena had finally collapsed before the small chipped statue of Our Lady, her heart a raw, bleeding wound of maternal desperation, Martha's vigil was particularly intense. The autumn air had turned sharp and cold, carrying with it the first biting promise of winter's harsh grip. Martha had finished her solitary supper of baked chicken and steamed broccoli, her movements precise and unhurried, as she meticulously cleaned her kitchen, polishing the chrome taps until they gleamed. She then settled into her favorite armchair by the window, a cup of fragrant herbal tea steaming gently beside her, its warmth a small comfort against the encroaching chill that seemed to emanate from outside. The evening news droned softly from the television, a low murmur of distant anxieties, but her attention was fixed with an almost magnetic intensity on the small silent house across the street. Dusk had painted the sky in bruised purples and grays, swiftly giving way to the inky blackness of a moonless night. A lone street lamp at the corner cast long, skeletal shadows of bare tree branches across the frosted lawns, transforming the familiar neighborhood into something stark and a little menacing. Elena's house, usually a warm square of faint yellow light, however dim, was utterly dark. Not a single lamp glowed in any window, no matter how small or hidden. It was as if the house itself held its breath, a silent, empty shell in the encroaching gloom, a place where life had simply, impossibly, ceased. Martha furrowed her brow, a familiar tightening in her chest, a knot of mingled worry and righteous indignation. This was beyond frugal. This was alarming. She imagined the inside, cold, silent, hollow, echoing with unseen emptiness. She pictured the children, little Leo and Sophia, shivering under thin blankets, their small bodies aching not just from the cold, but from something far more profound and agonizing: hunger. The thought, initially a prick of genuine if stern concern, quickly morphed into a hard, indigestible knot of judgment. How could Elena allow this? What kind of mother, however proud, however broken by grief and poverty, could bear to see her children suffer so profoundly, so needlessly, when the parish, Martha believed, stood ready to assist? Martha's mind raced, constructing scenarios, each more bleak than the last. Perhaps Elena had finally left, slipped away in the dead of night to some distant relative in another town, unable to face her destitution any longer. But the house still stood, unmoving, and the children's few toys, a worn teddy bear, a faded ball, were still faintly visible through the fading light of the windows. Or perhaps the dreaded thought she had finally resorted to: unspeakable acts to feed them. Martha's imagination, fueled by local whispers about other unfortunate families and the sensational headlines of cheap tabloids, conjured dark images, fleeting and horrifying, of desperation pushed to the brink of morality, to the edges of law. Martha watched for movement, for a flicker of light, for any sign of life. She watched until her eyes ached, dry and burning, until the cold from the window pane seeped into her bones, chilling her to the very marrow despite the warmth of her tea and the electric glow of her lamp. The house across the street remained resolutely dark, stubbornly silent. The silence was not peaceful. It was heavy, laden with the weight of absence, of what should be there but wasn't. There was no cheerful clatter of dinner plates, no muffled voices, no shadows flitting across the windows. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. It was the deepest, most profound silence she had ever witnessed emanating from a family home. A silence that screamed of desperation and abandonment. A void that Martha, with her earthly understanding, could only fill with dire conclusions. Her watchfulness, which she might have called concern, had now hardened into a firm, unshakable conviction, solid as the frozen ground outside. She saw the impenetrable darkness, the absolute stillness, the unnerving quietude, and her mind, ever predisposed to logic and earthly explanations, filled the void with its own grim certainties. To Martha, the evidence was clear. Elena Rossi had finally reached the absolute end of her resources, and whatever happened next, it would not be good, not by any human measure. She presumed the worst, not out of malice, but out of a rigid adherence to a world where problems were solved by human means, by practical steps, and where such utter deprivation could only lead to desperate measures, to choices no decent person should have to make. Martha's observations, so meticulously gathered, so logically interpreted, were laying the undeniable foundation for the disbelief and scandal that would inevitably follow. She saw with her own eyes what appeared to be an empty cupboard, a dark house, and hungry children. And in her heart, she concluded what she believed to be the only possible truth in such a bleak scenario. She was, ironically, the primary witness to this unfolding tragedy, a witness whose mind was utterly, completely unprepared to accept the possibility of anything beyond the purely human, the purely logical, the purely earthly. She, with her keen sight and her discerning mind, would be the one to see, but not comprehend, the extraordinary event that was poised to shatter her carefully constructed world. She would be the one to look upon the impossible, and, through the narrow lens of her own limited understanding, interpret it as anything but what it truly was: the tender, miraculous hand of God, reaching down in the quietest, most unexpected way. For even as Elena's final, desperate prayer ascended to the heavens, a raw, tearful plea from the depths of a mother's soul, Martha Gable, across the street, was unknowingly constructing the very prison of human reason that the coming miracle would so utterly, so gloriously, dismantle. She had seen the stage set for an earthly despair, and in her unwavering certainty, she had left no room, not even a sliver, for divine intervention. And so, even as Martha Gable, tucked away in the calculated dimness of her own home, had drawn her conclusions, cementing in her mind the logical, the purely earthly, even as she, with her keen sight and her discerning mind, had seen but not comprehended the extraordinary event that was poised to shatter her carefully constructed world, even as she looked upon the impossible and, through the narrow lens of her own limited understanding, prepared to interpret it as anything but what it truly was: the tender, miraculous hand of God, reaching down in the quietest, most unexpected way. For even as Elena's final, desperate prayer ascended to the heavens, a raw, tearful plea from the depths of a mother's soul, Martha Gable, across the street, was unknowingly constructing the very prison of human reason that the coming miracle would so utterly, so gloriously dismantle. She had seen the stage set for an earthly despair, and in her unwavering certainty she had left no room, not even a sliver, for divine intervention. But heaven, my dear friends, operates on a different logic, a different certainty. It is in those spaces where human reason finds no footing, where our earthly calculations fail us, that the divine often chooses to make its most profound statement. And it was precisely in such a space, in the profound, aching emptiness of Elena Rossi's humble home, that the impossible began to unfold. Elena, still on her knees, her face buried in her hands, felt the last reservoirs of her strength drain away. Her prayers had dwindled from impassioned pleas to fractured whispers, then to silent, soul-deep weeping. The chipped plaster statue of the Blessed Mother on the mantelpiece, usually a source of comfort, now seemed to witness her despair with an almost unbearable stillness. She felt in that moment utterly exposed, utterly bereft, a mother whose every resource, every hope, had finally, irrevocably run dry. The image of her children, small and vulnerable in their beds, their bellies aching, their dreams undoubtedly troubled by the gnawing phantom of hunger, was a torment she felt would surely break her. Then, faint at first, barely more than the settling of an old house in the deep quiet of the night, there came a sound. Knock. Elena froze, her breath caught in her throat. Her heart, which moments before had been a frantic drum against her ribs, now seemed to suspend itself in her chest. Had she imagined it? The wind? An errant branch against the window pane. Knock. A little clearer this time. Gentle. Not the sharp, insistent rap of a bill collector, whose visits had become a familiar, unwelcome punctuation mark in her life. Not the tentative, questioning tap of a neighbor, coming to offer a belated condolence or to borrow an egg she no longer possessed. No, this knock was different. It possessed a delicate resonance, a quality of quiet patience, almost musical in its cadence, yet utterly firm in its presence. It carried no threat, no urgency, only a soft, persistent invitation. Slowly, almost painfully, Elena uncurled herself from the floor, her joints stiff, her muscles protesting. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to ignore it, to retreat further into the shadows of her grief and exhaustion. Who could it be at such an hour? Her small clock on the shelf beside the statue glowed a dim, accusatory 11:47 p.m., the hour of wolves, of shadows, of unbidden fears. Yet something in the insistent gentleness of the sound compelled her, a fragile tendril of curiosity perhaps, or a mother's instinct, ever vigilant, ever hopeful, even against all odds. She moved through the small, dark living room, her bare feet silent on the worn rug. The cold radiating from the unheated windows seemed to cling to her, a physical manifestation of the chill in her soul. Each step felt heavy, like wading through deep water. As she neared the front door, a sliver of light almost imperceptible seemed to emanate from beneath it, a soft glow that subtly pushed back against the encroaching darkness within the house. It was not the harsh artificial yellow of a street lamp, nor the probing beam of a flashlight. This light was softer, warmer, like moonlight infused with something more profound. Her hand trembled as she reached for the cold brass doorknob. Doubt assailed her. Should she really open it? What if it was just some cruel prank, or worse? But the memory of that gentle, unique knock, devoid of any malice, kept her fingers on the latch. Taking a deep, ragged breath that tasted of tears and dust, Elena slowly, hesitantly pulled the door inward, just a crack at first. What she saw, and what she felt in that moment, would forever sear itself into the very fabric of her soul, altering the landscape of her faith and the trajectory of her life. Standing on her humble porch, bathed in that same soft, otherworldly light that seemed to pulse from within her, was a woman. She was not tall, nor imposing, but her presence filled the narrow space with an unexpected grace. A simple, dark blue shawl, woven of a fabric Elena had never seen before, a material that seemed to drink the dim porch light and then return it, shimmering with an almost liquid luminescence, was draped over her head and shoulders. It framed a face that instantly stilled Elena's frantic heart. My dear friends, how does one describe beauty that transcends the earthly? It was not the beauty of youth, though she seemed ageless. It was not the beauty of adornment, for she wore none. It was a beauty born of serene compassion, of profound sorrow embraced and transformed into an endless wellspring of love. Her eyes, the color of the midnight sky, held a depth that seemed to encompass all understanding, all suffering, and all hope. As Elena gazed into them, she felt an instant, unbidden sense of peace wash over her. A sudden, inexplicable cessation of the frantic fear and gnawing despair that had been her constant companions for so long. The cold that had clung to her moments before vanished, replaced by a gentle warmth that permeated her entire being, originating, it seemed, from the woman herself. The woman on the porch said nothing. She did not need to. Her very presence was a benediction. She simply looked at Elena, and in that gaze, Elena felt utterly seen, understood, and cherished. It was a love so pure, so unconditional, that it felt both intimately familiar and utterly new, a love she recognized instinctively from the deepest chambers of her soul. Then, slowly, gracefully, the woman extended her arms. In her hands, she held 2 large wicker baskets. They were simple baskets, woven of natural reeds, yet they too seemed to absorb and reflect that gentle inner light. Elena's eyes, still swimming with the unshed tears of her desperate prayer, widened. The aroma hit her first, a warm, yeasty scent of freshly baked bread, mingling with the rich, savory fragrance of roasted meat and the sweet, clean notes of fresh fruit. It was an assault on senses long accustomed to deprivation, a fragrant symphony that spoke of comfort and abundance. The first basket, which the woman held in her left hand, was indeed filled to overflowing. Nestled within a soft white cloth were several loaves of crusty, golden-brown bread, still warm to the touch. Beside them lay a block of creamy white cheese, wrapped in a delicate leaf, and a clay jug that, Elena knew with an intuitive certainty, contained fresh, cool milk. The second basket, held in the woman's right, offered an equally impossible bounty. There were plump, earthy potatoes, their skins still clinging to the rich soil. Bright crimson apples, perfectly ripe, glowed in the dim light, and nestled on a bed of fragrant herbs was a small, perfectly roasted chicken, its skin a deep, inviting gold, emanating a warmth that spread through the cold night air and seemed to chase away the last vestiges of winter from Elena's home. It was too much. It was impossible. Where could such food have come from? In this late hour, in this desolate town, for a woman who had nothing, absolutely nothing to offer in return. Elena's mind, accustomed to the stark realities of her impoverished life, grappled with the sheer unlikeliness of it all. Yet, her heart knew. Her heart understood. She was speechless. Her tongue, parched from weeping, felt thick and useless. All she could manage was a choked sound, a mixture of a gasp and a sob, as tears, no longer born of despair but of overwhelming gratitude and awe, streamed down her cheeks. Her hands, calloused and trembling, reached out hesitantly, as if afraid the vision would vanish, the bounty dissolve into thin air. The woman on the porch did not move, her serene gaze unwavering. She simply offered the baskets, a gesture of profound, unconditional love. As Elena took them, the weight in her arms was a startling reality, a testament to the tangibility of this miraculous encounter. The warmth from the bread, the chicken, seeped into her skin, a physical comfort that felt like a loving embrace. And then, as Elena struggled to stammer out a word, a thank you, a question, anything to bridge the chasm between the ordinary and the divine, the woman finally spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, not commanding, but like quiet music, a gentle stream flowing over smooth stones. It resonated with the same profound compassion that filled her eyes. "He always provides for his children," she said, the words a soft, unwavering melody that seemed to echo in Elena's very soul, filling every empty space. A simple sentence, yet in those few words, the entire universe seemed to align. Elena understood. She understood that her prayers had not merely been heard. They had been answered, not by human hands alone, not by earthly means, but by a love so immense, so attentive, that it reached down into the deepest, darkest hour of her life. The woman offered one last, gentle smile, a gesture of boundless affection that seemed to illuminate the entire street. Then, with a quiet grace that defied the laws of ordinary departure, she turned. She did not walk away with the usual clip-clop of shoes on pavement or the rustle of fabric. She simply seemed to recede. The shimmering blue shawl seemed to ripple, to dissolve slightly into the encroaching darkness of the night, taking the soft light with her. There was no sound of footsteps, no fading silhouette. One moment she was there, a luminous presence on Elena's humble porch, and the next, she was gone, leaving behind only the lingering scent of grace and the undeniable, tangible reality of the food in Elena's trembling arms. Elena stood there for a long moment, the heavy baskets clutched against her chest, the cold night air now feeling irrelevant against the warmth that had settled deep within her. The porch light, previously dim, now seemed almost painfully bright, casting harsh shadows where moments before there had been only a comforting glow. Her mind reeled, trying to grasp the enormity of what had just transpired. Was it a dream? Had despair finally twisted her mind? No. The solid weight of the baskets, the undeniable warmth emanating from the bread and the chicken, the distinct sweet smell of the apples, these were not phantoms of a dream. This was real, more real perhaps than anything she had ever experienced. Slowly, carefully, she stepped back inside, closing the door as gently as it had been knocked upon. She walked into her living room, placing the baskets with reverent care on the small scarred wooden table where her children usually ate. She stood over them, looking down at the impossible feast, her heart overflowing. The silence of the house, which had been so heavy with unspoken sorrow moments before, was now alive, vibrant with a different kind of quiet. A quiet born of profound wonder, of absolute gratitude, of a faith that had been stretched to its breaking point only to be remade, stronger and more radiant than ever before. She reached out a trembling hand and touched a loaf of bread, feeling its warmth. Then, the chicken. It was perfectly cooked, ready to be carved. The milk jug felt cool and substantial. Tears, fresh and cleansing, began to fall again. But these were tears of an entirely different nature. They were tears of pure joy, of absolute relief, of a mother's heart finding solace and deliverance in the most miraculous way imaginable. He always provides for his children. The quiet music of the woman's voice resonated in her mind, a profound truth now made manifest. Elena, kneeling once more, not in despair this time but in profound, adoring thanksgiving, knew with every fiber of her being that it had not been a dream. It had not been a kind neighbor, for no neighbor possessed such an otherworldly aura, such an ethereal grace, or such an impossible bounty. It had been something more, something divine. And I, your humble priest, who would later hear this story from Elena's own lips, understood then, as I understand now, the profound truth woven into the fabric of such moments. Miracles, my dear friends, are not always thunderous pronouncements or grand spectacles. Often they are quiet, gentle whispers in the darkest hours, a soft knock on a door when all hope seems lost, a reminder that the Divine Mother watches, and that her Son's love is an inexhaustible well, especially for his most vulnerable children. For Elena, on that night, the impossible had stepped through her threshold, not with fanfare, but with the quiet dignity of grace, leaving behind not just food for her children, but an unshakable testament to the abiding presence of heaven in a world so often consumed by earthly despair. She had prayed for deliverance, and deliverance, cloaked in a shimmering blue shawl, had answered her knock. The gentle click of the latch echoed in the profound silence of Elena's little home, a sound that felt both impossibly mundane and utterly sacred. She stood there, rooted to the spot, the cool night air still brushing against her cheek, her eyes wide, glistening with unshed tears. The two wicker baskets, heavy with life's very essence, sat on her threshold, pulsating with an inexplicable warmth, their bounty a fragrant testament to a love beyond earthly measure. She knelt, her knees aching from prayer, but now with a different kind of ache, the sweet agony of overwhelming grace, and lifted the baskets. They were heavier than they looked, not just with food, but with the palpable weight of a miracle. The scent that wafted from them was intoxicating. The rich, earthy aroma of freshly baked bread, still warm to the touch, mingled with the creamy sweetness of milk and cheese. From the other basket, the crisp, sweet perfume of apples cut through the deeper, savory promise of roasted chicken and wholesome potatoes. It was an aroma that banished the cold, hard reality of the empty cupboard, a symphony for senses long deprived. Elena carried them inside, moving as if in a dream, each step reverent. She placed them gently on her worn kitchen table, illuminated by the single sputtering candle that fought bravely against the encroaching darkness. Her hands, trembling just moments before from despair, now steadied with a powerful, inexplicable calm. She touched the smooth crust of the bread, feeling its warmth seep into her fingertips, then lifted the milk, still cool and fresh. This was no ordinary provision. This was a direct answer, an unequivocal affirmation of a mother's boundless love, delivered in the quietest, most profound way imaginable. Her children. Oh, her children. That was her first, most potent thought. With a renewed sense of purpose, Elena tiptoed to their small bedroom, the sounds of their light, hungry breathing tearing at her heart even as it now swelled with an almost unbearable joy. She knelt beside Leo's bed first, gently stroking his fevered brow. "Leo, my little lion," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Wake up, my son. God has sent us a blessing." Then to Sophia, her precious little bird. "My sweet Sophia, wake up, darling. Our Lady has come." Their eyelids fluttered open, heavy with sleep and the dull ache of hunger. At first they were confused, accustomed to the mornings bringing the promise of whatever meager fare their mother could conjure. But then, the rich scents from the kitchen began to penetrate their consciousness, pulling them from their slumber like an invisible, gentle hand. Leo's eyes, usually so wary, widened, then sparkled. Sophia, ever the more timid, sniffed the air, a small, hopeful smile gracing her lips. Elena led them to the table, and in the flickering candlelight, their faces were transfigured. The sight of the warm bread, the golden roasted chicken, the plump red apples, it was a feast beyond their wildest imaginings. They looked from the food to their mother, their small faces a mixture of disbelief and pure, unadulterated joy. "Mama," Leo whispered, his voice hushed with awe. "Is it real?" "Yes, my darlings," Elena choked out, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks. But these were tears of gratitude, of profound relief. "It is very, very real. Eat, my loves. Eat all you wish." And they did. They ate with an abandon that only hungry children possess, but also with a quiet reverence, as if sensing the sacred nature of their meal. The sounds of their contented chewing, the small murmurs of delight, filled the little house that had been so cold and silent just moments before. It was a feast that transcended mere physical nourishment. It was a communion, a sacrament, binding them together in the warmth of divine grace. Elena watched them, her heart overflowing, knowing that this was not just food, but living proof that heaven had heard her cries, that a mother's embrace was real, palpable, and infinitely merciful. The house, once desolate, now thrummed with a gentle, joyful energy that lingered well into the next morning. The children, their bellies full and their spirits lifted, played with a vigor not seen in months. They munched on apples on the front steps, their laughter ringing freely, while the lingering scent of roasted chicken and freshly baked bread still clung to the kitchen, a fragrant echo of the night's miracle. It was this very scent, carried on the crisp morning air, and the sight of Elena's children, rosy-cheeked and vibrant, enjoying fresh fruit, that stirred a familiar suspicion in Martha Gable's heart. From her window across the street, Martha had noted the darkness in Elena's home the previous night, the early bedtime, the undeniable signs of hardship. She knew Elena had nothing. So, how could there be apples? How could the rich aroma of a freshly roasted chicken waft from a house she knew to be empty of food? Martha's mind, accustomed to seeing the worst in human desperation, leapt to a grim conclusion. A mother, pushed to her limits, had surely resorted to theft. Her concern, as she framed it, quickly morphed into righteous indignation, and her hand without hesitation reached for the telephone. The first hint of trouble that morning was the distant wail of a police siren, a jarring intrusion into the newfound peace of Elena's street. It grew louder, drawing nearer, and soon a patrol car pulled up directly in front of Elena's small house, its flashing lights painting the quiet street with an unsettling dance of red and blue. My heart sank as I saw it, for I had been on my morning walk, a customary prayerful stroll around the parish, and found myself just a block away when the cruiser turned onto Elena's street. A cold dread settled in my stomach. Something was deeply, terribly wrong. I hurried towards the scene, my pastoral collar feeling heavier than usual, arriving just as the two officers, their faces grim, were knocking on Elena's door. Martha Gable, of course, was already at her own doorstep, a self-appointed witness to the impending drama. Elena answered the door, her face serene, a small, almost beatific smile playing on her lips. She held a half-eaten apple in one hand, offering a stark contrast to the officer's stern expressions. "Mrs. Rossi," one of the officers began, his voice official, tinged with a weariness born of dealing with human failing. "We received a report of unusual activity last night concerning some groceries." Elena simply nodded, her eyes wide and clear. "Yes, officer. Groceries. Mrs. Rossi," the other officer interjected, his gaze sweeping over the simple interior of her home, past the children now peeking from behind her, past the lingering aromas of a recent meal. "Mrs. Gable here reported that you had no food last night, yet we detect the smell of a roast, and your children are eating apples." He gestured vaguely at the fruit in her hand and the children. "Could you explain where this food came from?" The air in the small living room grew thick with unspoken accusation, with the weight of worldly suspicion confronting an otherworldly truth. The officers looked at her expectantly, prepared for evasions, for tears of guilt, for any of the usual desperate narratives. Martha Gable, from her vantage point, leaned forward, her expression a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity. And I, your humble priest, stood there, my heart pounding, wondering how Elena, a woman of such gentle spirit, would navigate this impossible interrogation. Would her pride force her to weave a fabrication? Would her desperation lead her astray? Elena looked at them, then turned her gaze towards me, her eyes meeting mine with an unwavering certainty that stilled the very air. Her voice, when it came, was soft, clear and resonant, carrying a truth so profound it silenced every other sound in the room, even the chirping of the morning birds outside. "Father," she said, her voice a balm, a testament to pure, unshakable faith. "It was no thief." She paused, a gentle, knowing smile illuminating her face. "It was Our Lady. She knocked on my door." A hush fell. The officers exchanged bewildered glances, their trained professionalism momentarily cracking under the weight of an explanation utterly outside their jurisdiction, outside their understanding. There was no crime, no victim, no earthly explanation for the impossible abundance of food that had transformed Elena's home from a place of despair into a sanctuary of grace. There was only the testimony of a mother delivered from the depths of her suffering, whose simple, profound words proclaimed a truth that resonated not just in her small house, but deep within the soul of anyone willing to listen. The police, bless their bewildered hearts, eventually left with a report that read more like a fable. How do you quantify the impossible, or document grace? Yet, the truth, once spoken, took on a life of its own. It didn't spread through St. Jude's like gossip. It moved like a quiet, undeniable gospel, igniting wonder in even cynical souls. And then there was Martha Gable. The very next morning she stood on Elena's doorstep, not with accusation but with downcast eyes, a trembling hand, and a steaming casserole. Her offering was more than food. It was profound repentance, a silent acknowledgement that some mysteries transcend human suspicion. She, like many, had been deeply touched. The miracle, you see, wasn't simply those baskets of fresh bread and roasted chicken. It reawakened our entire parish. We saw in Elena's desperate trial and wondrous deliverance a reflection of our own struggles, our quiet hungers, and our profound hope. Her simple, unwavering faith opened a channel for grace, flooding not just her home but all of ours, with a renewed sense of God's tangible presence. And I, your humble narrator, understood then that God's greatest miracles are often the quietest. A gentle knock in the dead of night, a whispered prayer answered by a presence unseen. These are reminders that even when we feel abandoned, heaven watches, and a mother's love is always, always listening.